2 of the fantasy football season is in the books, and we are heading straight into week 3. And oh my goodness, if this season has not proved that fantasy football is pain, then I don't know what other season could have proven this. Sometimes I don't even know, why do we play fantasy football and invest countless hours into fantasy football? But hey, I guess this is just part of the game. So you know what we're going to do. We're going to break down every single matchup, every single relevant player at the wide receiver position, and I'm going to tell you who you should be starting or sitting moving into week 3. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 3 pick'ems are already going live, and if you want to claim a free pick'em for Thursday night football, Aaron Rodgers over half of a total yard, use promo code The Catch down below to claim that free pick'em to use towards any week 3 pick'em combinations that you guys are eyeing. And while you are at it, you're going to receive a 50% first time deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. That's up to $1,000 on Underdog that you can use towards any week 3 pick'ems on top of that free Aaron Rodgers over half of a total yard pick'em. Let's break down our start sit wide receivers. All right, let's kick things off with Thursday Night Football. We have the New England Patriots traveling to face the New York Jets. So let's start with the Patriots side here. Saw a little bit of inspiration from this wide receiver core in week 1 with Jalen Polk coming through with a touchdown and 9.2 fantasy points, but still just 3 targets for Polk in this passing attack led by Jacoby Brissett. And on top of that, we had just 2 targets for KJ Osborne and 0 targets for Demario Douglas. There's really nothing here from a fantasy standpoint, even in deeper leagues. If you're holding on to like a Jalen Polk, Douglas, Osborne, I guess those are really the only guys I think in redraft we're holding on to at the moment. You just don't need to, there's just not enough life in this passing attack for any of these New England Patriots wide receivers to be relevant, and especially to be relevant against a pass defense that the New York Jets team has. So I am sitting all Patriots wide receivers, even in deeper full PPR formats. Let's move along to the Jets. And really, when we're looking at this wide receiver room on a week in, week out basis, I think it's just going to be Garrett Wilson, and then you're looking at touchdown or bust for every other single player. To the Allen Lazard truthers, well, I wasn't necessarily in disagreement with you after week 1. I was still like, let's kind of pump the brakes. We're not going to flex or start Allen Lazard in week 2. We need a larger sample size. And we have a larger sample size, at least now 2 games, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 11 receiving yards for Lazard in week 2, 3.1 fantasy points compared to that massive week 1 performance where he had 26.9 fantasy points and 2 touchdowns. So do I think Lazard maybe can do things this season? Sure, but how consistent is going to be? How confident are we going to be in having him in our fantasy lineup? I think the answer is going to be pretty low. Mike Williams had a target this past week after a 0 target performance in week 1 where he was only on the field for 18% of snaps, and that 1 target in week 2 turned into 1 reception and 2.9 fantasy points. So we're not starting Mike Williams. We're not looking at guys like Xavier Gibson or Malachi Corley anytime soon. It's just Garrett Wilson in this offense at the wide receiver position, and even then, with a fully healthy Aaron Rodgers, the ceiling has been pretty low. He has 2 tough matchups. He gets the Patriots this week, then he gets the Broncos next week. So we're going to get a good look at, what we're going to get out of Garrett Wilson against stronger secondaries, not to necessarily say that Tennessee in week 2 with Snead out there at corner was not a strong secondary. But at the end of the day, I'm a little concerned about Garrett Wilson and what his ceiling is going to be this year. He might turn into kind of a touchdown dependent wide receiver when we're searching for that ceiling, but you still have to start him. At least he's giving you double-digit fantasy points in the first 2 weeks of the season. We'll see how things go heading into week 3. Moving along to Sunday's action, let's take a look at the Giants traveling to face the Browns. Malik Neighbors, one of my must-start wide receivers going into week 2 against that very poor Washington Commanders secondary. Walked away with 28 fantasy points, 127 receiving yards, and a touchdown. 18 targets, 10 receptions for you Malik Neighbors truthers in redraft formats. This was an absolute win, mainly because he saw a 55% target share. So we are going to have matchups this year where a team with an offense and quarterback as bad as the Giants go up against really poor defenses, and Malik Neighbors is going to absolutely feast. But I think in general, we're seeing that target share is probably going to keep him relevant enough that he's going to be a week in, week out start, even against tougher defenses like the Browns this week or the Cowboys next week. So Malik Neighbors, I think, is still a solid start, even going from the worst defense in the league to a defense that is at least much better in the Cleveland Browns. Looking at Randall Robinson, this is a player that I talked about throughout last week as like a desperation low-end flex guy, and I think he is again this week. In week 1, 12 targets, and week 2 found the end zone. So not a high ceiling here, but if you're in a bad enough spot, I do believe that you could flex Randall Robinson, or if you're in a deeper league, you could. I'm not going to go out of my way to do so, but he is the true number 2 wide receiver on this team. Darius Slayton, 4 targets in each game so far this year, no more than 6.3 fantasy points in a game this year. Just not relevant enough to be a fantasy option, even in deeper formats. Moving along to the Browns. Let's start with Amari Cooper, who I think there is plenty of reason at this point to start to be a little bit panicked on. I still had him as a start moving into week 2. He's been downgraded to a flex for me. We're going to talk about a lot of wide receivers throughout today's video that have maybe been on your bench. Maybe you took the risk and started them over guys you drafted earlier. And I think as we're getting to the point closer and closer to weeks 4, 5, and 6, getting closer to the middle part of the season, we're going to find out that there's going to be some of these players that need to not be on the bench, or not considered flex options, and need to be starting over players like Amari Cooper. I will say this much for Cooper, who has had no more than 4.1 fantasy points in a game through the first 2 weeks. He at least had 9 targets in week 1 and 8 targets in week 2, but he's come away with just 5 total receptions. So, and I mean, the total receiving yardage has been really low as well. He's only at 27 total receiving yards on the season. So, Cooper in a different situation maybe would be different, but we also have Deshaun Watson throwing him the football, which has been not good for the fantasy wide receivers on the Browns thus far. So Cooper downgraded to a flex for me, and I feel a little shaky about that. Now, let's talk about Jerry Jeudy, who I talked about going into week 2. He's made the waiver wire video 2 weeks in a row. Currently sitting at 60% rostered, so a little bit higher rostered. But I talked about this after week 1. We look at the Browns' schedule. It is very favorable for the wide receiver position over the next several weeks. They had Jacksonville this past week, and now coming up, we have the Giants, the Raiders, the Commanders, the Eagles, and the Bengals. Overall, a very solid stretch here over the next 6 weeks. So if you are looking for a low-end flex, I do think that Jerry Jeudy is a good option, and arguably, at least looking at the data, a better option than Amari Cooper. Jeudy has had at least 6 targets through the first 2 games. In week 1, he had a touchdown, and in week 2, he had 73 total receiving yards, putting him at 11 or more fantasy points in each game through the first 2 weeks. So the ceiling might not be incredibly high here, but if he's walking away with double digits, this is the wide receiver to keep an eye on in this Browns offense when Cooper is not walking away with double digits. And once again, the ceiling might actually increase because this stretch, in terms of strength of schedule against the wide receiver position coming up, is very favorable. So trust me, I know I'm not a Jerry Jeudy guy, but everything is pointing to, the signs here that we need to take him a little bit more seriously in full PPR formats. Now, let's talk about Elijah Moore, who did have 10 fantasy points, double digits as well in week 2 after having 3.9 in week 1. A little bit more volatility here. He is, seeing 8 targets in week 2 and 6 targets in week 1. So maybe something to consider there. The target volume has been pretty good for these first 3 wide receivers that we were talking about in terms of the Browns, but I'm just not confident enough to even flex Elijah Moore. Maybe in a deeper format, you're keeping an eye on him in the waivers, but that's about it. We'll see if we get a better sample size over the next coming weeks with that, nice schedule for the position. Cedric Tillman, 2 targets in week 2, 1 target in week 1. We're not considering him in any format whatsoever at the time being. So there we go. Giants, Browns. We'll see what happens. Next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Saints. And this one's a little bit shaky because I have to record these videos Monday morning before Monday Night Football has even happened. So, we do know that A.J. Brown's not playing in week 2. But I think this is just pretty easy to say, regardless of the matchup, regardless of the defense. If A.J. Brown is starting, you're going to start him. So he gets hit with the asterisk for this video. But if he's out there ready to go week 3, even on the road against the Saints, we are still starting A.J. Brown, who had 22 fantasy points in week 1. It'll be interesting to see, what the volume looks like for Devonta Smith in Monday Night Football, how much of an increase he gets as, playing as a wide receiver 1. But even regardless, if Brown is playing, he's not playing, Devonta Smith is a must-start wide receiver week in, week out. No doubt about it. Nothing to really talk about. I'm still going to have Jahan Dotson as a sit. Maybe, Monday Night Football, he does something. But until we see that, I don't want to start him in any format. And I'm going to have a suspicion that A.J. Brown will play in week 3, which will put Dotson's value much lower, even if Dotson does something in Monday night. So Eagles on a week in, week out basis, we're starting A.J. Brown, we're starting Devonta Smith when they are healthy, and we are moving right along. All right, Chris Olave got you double digits in week 2. Thank God, after having 3.1 fantasy points in week 1. Had 6 targets, 4 receptions, 81 receiving yards, 20.2 yards per catch, 12.8 fantasy points. So Olave, one of these players, might feel like a low end, wide receiver 1 or 2 on your team, depending on when you had to draft him. But I still think he's a player we're just starting on a week in, week out basis, especially with how good the Saints have looked lately. And on top of that, a Philadelphia Eagles secondary that has not been very good so far on the season and was not good last year as well. So Chris Olave, maybe there's not a tremendous amount of upside, but we're still starting him at home against the Eagles. Now, Rashid Shaheed, I was a little wary of going into week 2 because I've been on the Rashid Shaheed ride several times, and it's a little bit bumpy. But before Monday Night Football has been played, he is currently sitting as the wide receiver 9 in fantasy football moving into week 3. 20 fantasy points in week 2. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown after 5 targets, 3 receptions, 73 receiving yards, and a touchdown in week 1. He has 16 or more fantasy points in each game this year so far. The volume is still low, so I'm a little wary of Rashid Shaheed. I think he's a player that gets moved up to the start category, but you just have to understand there will be volatility with a player like Shaheed throughout the season. So I'm moving him up to the start. I'm not going to say he's a risky flex this week. This Saints offense firing on all cylinders. It's a good matchup. So for that reason, especially, I have Shaheed up as a start. But I'm just telling you guys, I have drafted a lot of Rashid Shaheed in his first 2 years in the league. And it is a bumpy ride, but maybe this is kind of like Jameson Williams moving into a wide receiver 2 spot with the Lions, and Shaheed's just going to be a factor all season long, really, no matter what. They're definitely finding ways to get him the football and get him the football early in games, so we like to see that. So Shaheed, well, maybe there's a little part of me that's still a little nervous. I've got him as a start approaching week 3. All right, moving along, let's take a look at the Texans traveling to face the Minnesota Vikings. And really, for me, on a week in, week out basis, you are starting every single Texans wide receiver. We'll break down each of these guys. And I know that there's some concerns about Diggs and Dell, but we'll go ahead and have a little chat here. So, Nico Collins was my most drafted Texans wide receiver, and so far that's paying off. 17.7 fantasy points in week one, 27.5 in week two. Overall is the clear-cut number one wide receiver on this team who's going to be the most consistent as the season goes on. Before Monday Night Football has been filmed, he is currently sitting as the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football at the moment. This was something I talked about in the offseason. Like, some people worried like Collins not going to get as much volume because you got Dell coming back healthy and you got Diggs added to this offense. And my argument was Diggs and Dell on the field is good for Collins. It's very tough to line up against this Texans wide receiver room. Less defensive pressure on Nico Collins is a good thing. I think we're going to continue to see him ball out on a week in, week out basis. Now, when it comes to Diggs and Tank Dell, I think you get more volatility there. Maybe they're touchdown dependent. Maybe Dell is the wide receiver who's getting pushed back in terms of volume in this offense, going from 7 targets in week one to just 4 in week two, a total of 2.3 fantasy points in week two. And then Diggs, 6 targets in each game this year, but no touchdowns in week two, brought him to just 7.7 total fantasy points. So I can understand if you have concerns about Diggs or Dell, but the way this offense has been playing, in my mind, they are still starts. Even if you are, downgrading maybe a Tank Dell to the flex spot, maybe if you're in a double flex format, you have other players that you're more confident in starting. I'm okay with all of that. But I still think if you drafted Collins, Diggs, or Dell, for the time being, we have to continue to try and trust the process and start all of these guys. They'll get the Vikings, the Jags, the Bills in the next 3 weeks. So some pretty good matchups before they face a tougher stretch of the Patriots and the Packers in week 6 and 7. So I've got them as starts. It depends on who you have on your bench or on your roster, I should say, in terms of should you start another wide receiver over Diggs or Dell. Be a little bit roster dependent, but I'm still okay with starting both players. All right, moving along to Justin Jefferson, who should probably have an asterisk by his name because he did suffer a quad injury, a quad contusion in that week 2 matchup against the Niners, where he also had 23 total fantasy points, sitting at the wide receiver 6 at the time I'm recording this. Not a lot of discussion when it comes to JJ. If you drafted him, you are starting him. Sam Darnold looks good at quarterback, so we can throw that out the window. The quarterback play has been just fine. This is a great offensive scheme at the end of the day, so nothing to really talk about with JJ, but I did want to mention, if you're worried about JJ coming off the injury, if he plays, you start him. No doubt about it. All right, let's look at Jalen Naylor and Jordan Addison. And the reason why they get asterisks is because this wide receiver room is a little bit tough to evaluate because we have the Addison injury, we have the JJ injury. I think he'll be fine. And how does that really impact this wide receiver room and who we should start or sit and all that stuff? It's all definitely relevant. I think if Addison, who has a chance to play in week 3, is out there, just looking at how this offense has looked through the first 2 games, you probably go ahead and you start Jordan Addison as a low-end flex. And I think really regardless of if we see missed time from JJ or Addison continued into week 3, you can still flex Jalen Naylor if you're desperate enough. I talked about Jalen Naylor going into week 2 as a solid low-end flex, last-minute flex if you were dealing with an injured player like A.J. Brown, for example, or Kenneth Walker in the flex. And he showed up, 14.4 fantasy points, had a touchdown, 54 receiving yards, and 3 receptions. Not crazy volume, but definitely part of this game plan against the Niners. And in week 1, he had a touchdown as well. So I think that Naylor could end up being a player, even if Addison is back in action, who continues to get reps, especially when we're seeing JJ a little dinged up and Addison, coming off the injury. It's going to be smart for the Vikings to continue to include Jalen Naylor in their game plan. So Naylor, low-end flex, Addison, low-end flex. This team's at home. It's not a fantastic matchup against the Texans, but certainly not an awful matchup. And the Vikings, one of the more surprising teams for a lot of people through the first 2 weeks of the season, I think continue to have another solid offensive day in week 3 at home. So got a couple flex options. You're definitely starting JJ, and we are going to roll out all the Texans wide receivers for one more week. We'll see what happens. All right, moving along, we've got the Broncos and whatever their wide receiver room is traveling to face the Buccaneers, who have a very stout wide receiver room. So let's talk about the Broncos first. And I'm sitting everybody here. I just can't do it with this Broncos wide receiver room, okay? Cortland Sutton, who I thought would be a nice value in drafts in the offseason, has not really clicked with rookie quarterback Bo Nix, and it's been an absolute disaster. 7.8 fantasy points in week 1. He did have 12 targets, but only caught 4 passes, and then in week 2, 3.6 fantasy points against that Steelers defense. So it's not necessarily a bad matchup for the Broncos wide receivers here, but I just have no confidence this week in this Broncos offense. Marvin Mims had 2 targets, 1 reception. Little Jordan Humphrey, his name's not on the screen, but worth noting, he had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 9 fantasy points in week 2. I'm not trusting little Jordan Humphrey in my starting lineup in fantasy, though. Then I guess Josh Reynolds, 8 targets week 1. 5 targets week 2 and 13 fantasy points in week 2 after 9.5 in week 1. Like, sure, we could mention Josh Reynolds here. We've seen him be productive, here and there with the Rams and the Lions. He's a decent veteran wide receiver when called upon. I'm not risking Josh Reynolds in my starting lineup anytime soon. You'd have to be in a very deep format for me to even somewhat consider it. So I'm sitting on the Broncos wide receivers. I don't think anyone's going to really disagree with that. All right, looking at the Buccaneers, we got Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. I mean, you just can't sit these guys. Chris Godwin, a guy that we talked a lot about in the offseason, already coming to fruition. He is absolutely balling. He's the wide receiver 1 at the time of recording this in fantasy football. He's the only wide receiver in fantasy football to score 20 or more fantasy points in each game so far this year. He is absolutely excelling, primarily playing in the slot. He gets another good matchup against the Broncos this week because Mike Evans is more than likely going to get the Pat Surtain treatment. So Godwin is not coming out of your starting lineup anytime soon. Mike Evans, 2 touchdowns week 1, 23 fantasy points, and then went to 7.2 fantasy points in week 2. So, yeah, I mean, you probably are going to feel like Mike Evans is touchdown dependent at times throughout the year. The good note from week 2 is he still had 6 total targets. The bad note was he was going up against a bad secondary, and it didn't really mean a whole lot, although the Buccaneers offensive line played really poorly Sunday. So a little bit maybe of a different game plan than the Bucs were anticipating. But at the end of the day, it's Mike Evans. You're still starting him. It's a decent enough matchup. Broncos not necessarily a bad secondary, but they also have moments or have shown moments so far in the season where they're not great. But Evans will probably have Pat Surtain on him. Am I going to freak out about it? No, because it's Mike Evans. Hopefully we see a touchdown this week, but even if we don't, he's just a player you can't afford to bench. Jalen McMillan, I was hoping for more of out of in week 2, 2 targets, 1 reception, had the touchdown week 1, 10 fantasy points. He's definitely a player I still think is worth rostering and watching as the season progresses. You could have some nice moments throughout the year, but here in week 3, I don't think there's any reason to start Jalen McMillan. All right, moving along, we got the Packers traveling to face the Tennessee Titans, and I had maybe too much confidence in Jaden Reed in week 2. My thesis was somebody's still going to get the football here, even if Malik Willis is the quarterback, and Jaden Reed's the most talented wide receiver who was the most involved in week 1. So, you could still flex Jaden Reed in week 2 if you needed to, and now, after watching Malik Willis at quarterback, I'm just going to sit all the Packers wide receivers. But I will say there is a chance that Jordan Love plays in week 3. And I've even read that there was a strong chance that he almost played in week 2. So obviously, if Jordan Love is playing in week 3, we reevaluate here, probably start Jaden Reed, probably turns Christian Watson into a flex, Romeo Doubs into a low-end flex, and then I'm not ready to start Dontavion Wicks yet. I know he had the touchdown in week 2. I'm just not ready to start him yet. I mean, you got in week 2, 4 targets for Wicks, 3 for Dobbs, 0 for Watson, concerning there, and just 2 for Jaden Reed. So obviously these numbers are very different. We look at Jordan Love when, he was healthy in week 1. He still had Wicks with 3 targets, Dobbs with 7, Watson with 5, and Reed with 6. So Maybe this is more contingent on Jordan Love being healthy than anything, but if he's not, then we're sitting all these guys. And the Titans defense, in terms of their secondary, has played pretty well through the first 2 weeks of the season. So we'll go ahead and, not really view the Packers wide receivers with a tremendous amount of upside going into week 3. All right, let's move along to the Titans offense and let's talk about Calvin Ridley, who showed up in week 2. To me, I was very close to taking him out of the flex category against his Jets secondary and downgrading him to a sit. And I just kind of left him as if you need to, you can start Calvin Ridley in week 2. And hopefully some of you guys did end up flexing him. He's still the fantasy wide receiver 15 at the time I'm recording this, but, had a big day. 2 touchdowns in week 2. One of them on the ground, but then that big receiving touchdown and a total of 24.7 fantasy points. So, the Packers defense has looked good through the first, I should say looked good in the second game of the season, almost through the first 2 games of the season. They looked bad in week 1, but, this is a road game for the Packers, and I do think this defense will have opportunities in this game because Will Levis still looks like an absolute nightmare at quarterback, but because Ridley had the strong performance in week 2, I'm going to keep him in the flex category where you drafted him. You're probably hoping that you can continue to flex him and he'll get enough volume as the season goes on. So Ridley, we can keep at the flex. DeAndre Hopkins is going to be borderline droppable for me at this point. Right now, he has a total of 3.7 fantasy points through the first 2 weeks. So he is an absolute sit for me. And Tyler Boyd has scored 4.8 fantasy points in week 1 and 4.6 in week 2. He's also not getting anywhere near my starting lineup anytime soon, especially with Will Levis at the quarterback position. All right, moving along, let's take a look at the Bears traveling to face the Indianapolis Colts. And kind of an interesting matchup here, but let's start with the Bears wide receivers. DJ Moore was getting close to a sit moving into the week, but he's had double-digit fantasy points in each game this year. So 10 in week 1, 11 in week 2, 10 targets in week 2, 53 receiving yards. So, even with Caleb Williams only throwing for 174 passing yards in week 2 and just 93 in week 1, the volume is still here for DJ Moore. He's still the best wide receiver on this team, and he's going to continue to be a start. Got a little downgraded here to a flex. He might still end up as a wide receiver 2 for a lot of you guys. I'm just worried about this Bears offense on the road here. The Colts defense hasn't looked very inspiring through the first 2 games of the season, but this Bears offensive line just looks like a peewee football team lining up. So I'm a little worried about DJ Moore, but I'm going to say he can still stay in starting lineups. Hopefully we can get some touchdown production out of him. That would really be elevating these fantasy stat lines. But the fact he's at least hit double digits 2 weeks in a row, can have confidence, but the ceiling is low. Keenan Allen, I've got as a sit. I don't even know if he's going to play in week 3. He was inactive in week 2 with that heel injury. He might play in week 3. I don't know. He had 6.9 fantasy points in week 1. Did have 11 targets in week 1. Sat out week 2. It feels too risky. I don't really want to start Keenan Allen coming off of this injury. Rome Odunze has been a little bit banged up dealing with that knee injury, but he did play in week 2 as the wide receiver 2 for this team. Came away 5 targets, 2 receptions, 33 receiving yards, and 5.3 fantasy points. So do I feel good about Rome Odunze right now? No, I don't think we're even going to consider him in the flex. Either Keenan Allen plays or not. And if for some reason you were considering DeAndre Carter, who kind of stepped in here because Keenan Allen didn't play, we're not considering DeAndre Carter anytime soon until we see an improvement out of this Bears offense. It's just you're flexing DJ Moore, and that's it. Okay, let's move along to the Colts, who have also had some concerns at the wide receiver 1 position. Anthony Richardson looked a little off in week 2 through 3 interceptions compared to a better passing attack in week 1, where he threw 2 touchdowns to 1 pick. In week 2, it was 1 touchdown to 3 picks. So Pittman has suffered here. I mean, 8 targets in week 1, 7 in week 2, not bad, but just 7.1 fantasy points in week 1, 5.1 in week 2. So I'm a little concerned about Pittman. He's another one of these wide receivers who you took in like the 3rd, 4th round, and you're expecting him to either, be like a steal wide receiver 1 or at least a wide receiver 2. So far on the season, similar to like DJ Moore, right? We've had concerns. And with Pittman, I think there's more, reason for concern. So he gets downgraded to a flex. The Bears defense hasn't particularly been bad. I'm definitely worried about Michael Pittman. I don't think it's time to necessarily bench him unless you've got guys like Jamison Williams and Rashid Shaheed on the bench, but I'm definitely concerned he gets downgraded from a start to a flex. Now, Alec Pierce, on the other hand, is sitting at 23% rostered, has to be considered one of the top waiver priorities if you did not pick him up going into week 2. I think a lot of people are like, just 3 targets, 3 receptions in week 1, and myself included. Like, I don't know how I exactly feel about trusting Alec Pierce yet, but 7 targets, 5 receptions, 56 receiving yards, a touchdown, 11.2 yards per catch, and 16 fantasy points in week 2 after that 21.5 fantasy point performance in week 1. Right now, Alec Pierce is the Indianapolis Colts wide receiver to own. So, the Bears this week, Pittsburgh next week. It's not a great schedule in the next 2 weeks, but at the same time, we got to look at the data. And right now, all the signs are pointing towards Alec Pierce being a thing. So I wouldn't be more confident than, looking at him as a flex option. But Alec Pierce, I mean, we'll see if the production continues because right now it is certainly there. So he comes in as a flex option. Now, A.D. Mitchell, just not enough here. 5 targets week 1, 4 in week 2, just 1 reception in each game. Just not enough. We can't consider him in any format. Then we'll see if Josh Downs is ready for week 3. He hasn't played in the first 2 games of the season, but even with, Josh Downs having production last year, if Josh Downs is ready for this game, I'm not going to be ready to roll him out in any fantasy lineups anytime soon, the way this passing attack has looked for the Colts. So I actually feel the most confident in Alec Pierce right now, but he still is a flex as we approach week 3. All right, moving along, we got the Chargers facing the Steelers, and an interesting wide receiver room to evaluate here for the Chargers. So the Steelers defense at home does make me a little bit worried, okay? So the secondary's been good. It hasn't necessarily been the strongest part of this Steelers defense. The front 7 has, and the Chargers have looked good through the first 2 games of the season, but I want to go in with a little bit of caution when we look at these Chargers wide receivers because, Ladd McConkey, who I think is a low-end flex option, had 14 fantasy points in week 1, then just 4.6 in week 2 against Carolina. The game script didn't really benefit him, but also we saw red zone targets go to Quentin Johnston. So I like what we've seen out of Ladd McConkey in his rookie season, but I don't know exactly what the consistency is going to look like on a week in, week out basis, and he might be a bit touchdown dependent. So if you're in a bad enough spot, I still think you can flex Ladd McConkey, but like I said, he might end up being touchdown dependent. And Quentin Johnston, remember him? He was back from the dead. 2 touchdowns in week 2, 22 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 51 receiving yards. And yeah, Quentin Johnston might be a player who we want to pick up off the waiver wire and all of that stuff. But are you going to be confident enough against the Steelers defense to start Quentin Johnston in week 3, even in the flex? You'd have to be pretty desperate to do so. So I have Quentin Johnston as a sit. Definitely a player worth picking up off the waiver wire. Definitely a player to monitor in this week 3 matchup. But I'm not going to be going out of my way to start him in week 3. And then week 4, the Chargers get Kansas City. Week 6, after the bye week in week 5, they had the Broncos. So might be opportunity in more competitive game scripts, but also a couple tough defenses coming up. And then we got Josh Palmer, who, a lot of people viewed as like the potential wide receiver 1 that you could draft late this year for the Chargers. And he's got 6 targets through the first 2 games, no more than 3.9 fantasy points through the first 2 or in each game this year. So he's also dealing with a knee injury. So Josh Palmer, who was active for week 2, just hasn't looked like himself or really like a huge part of this offense. So Palmer not getting anywhere near our fantasy lineups anytime soon. Moving along to the Steelers here. George Pickens is just going to be a low end flex week in and week out. I don't know exactly what his ceiling looks like. Justin Fields threw for 156 yards in week 1, then 117 in week 2. I don't think the Steelers, who lead their division, are going to switch from Fields to Russell Wilson, but there's a chance if that happens. I think that elevates Pickens' ceiling, but as long as they're winning games, I think they're going to keep Justin Fields at the quarterback position. So Pickens, 13.5 fantasy points in week 1, 4.9 in week 2. I'm like, yeah, he's a low-end flex. The volume is there. He's the true wide receiver 1 on this team, but we just can't get overly excited about Pickens, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Van Jefferson, 3.4 fantasy points in week 2. Calvin Austin, 1.6, and also is a little bit banged up. There's just nothing here when we look at this wide receiver room for the Steelers other than George Pickens, and even then, you got to be a little bit worried. So I don't really view this Chargers-Steelers game as like a high-scoring affair. So we've got 2 low-end flexes with Ladd McConkey and George Pickens, and I'm going to sit everybody else at the wide receiver position as we approach week 3. All right, moving along, let's take a look at the Dolphins traveling to face the Seahawks, and certainly a couple interesting things we need to go over when we evaluate the wide receiver room for the Dolphins. And really, is Tua Tagovailoa going to be playing in week 3? I think a majority of people would absolutely say that Tua's not going to play in week 3. But it is worth noting there is technically a chance that he plays. At the time I'm recording this, he has not been ruled out. There's discussion that he might head to IR. I'm going to go ahead and say that Tua's not going to play, but in case he ends up playing miraculously, then maybe we look at Hill and Waddle a little bit differently. But with that being said, with Skylar Thompson at set to be the quarterback 1 here for the Dolphins, I think you can still start Tyreek Hill. I think you basically have to, and I think that you could easily argue that the ceiling is going to be lower for Tyreek Hill. I have no problem with that, but we've seen Hill in the past play with backup quarterbacks. He's still Tyreek Hill. You've still got players like Devontae Adams who are still productive with low-end quarterbacks. You look at Justin Jefferson last year at the end of the season with Nick Mullins, So, yes, the ceiling's lower, but this is still Tyreek Hill. I don't even want to overthink it or discuss it too much. If you own Hill, you can continue to start him. Not the greatest matchup here, but once again, it's Tyreek Hill. So moving along to Jalen Waddle. Okay, I do have him downgraded as a flex. I think he suffers the most without Tua at the quarterback position. Still at 8.5 fantasy points in week 2, although that game was basically a lost cause. So maybe in some more competitive game scripts, we see more out of Waddle. I think he gets kind of downgraded to the low-end flex category. We've talked about a lot of wide receivers that we drafted in this range. You're getting kind of downgraded. And I just don't know if the quarterback position here is going to be enough to really produce those higher scoring ceilings we're looking for out of Jalen Waddle on a consistent basis. So he gets downgraded, assuming that Tua isn't playing. And really, when you look at the wide receivers for this team, there's just nobody else to go. There's just nobody else, Braxton Berrios and Malik Washington have done nothing this year, and this is a very thin wide receiver room. So it's Hill and Waddle. You can still start them, and let's hope that Tua Tagovailoa is okay, and if he decides to keep playing football, hopefully it helps out 2 very valuable fantasy wide receivers in Hill and Waddle. All right, moving along, let's take a look at the Seahawks here. DK Metcalf, I was a little leery of going into week 2, but still told you guys you got to start him. Just 4 targets in week 1, 5.9 fantasy points. Then a tougher matchup against New England in week 2, but walked away with 28.9 fantasy points, had that long touchdown early in the game. 129 receiving yards and 14 targets, most importantly. Got that volume way up. So Metcalf, I think is just going to be a player. I said it last week, Metcalf, tough matchup on the road against the Patriots. Looked bad in week 1, but you just got to start Metcalf, and he proved wise. So I think JSN is okay as a flex opportunity, mainly because this Dolphins secondary has looked really bad to start the season. And I feel like JSN is kind of one of these guys you drafted to be kind of a boomer bust type player. So if you want to throw him in the flex, I'm okay with it. But I also really like the fact that JSN had 16 targets in week 2. I mean, 16 targets is a very strong mark. Walked away with 12 receptions, 117 receiving yards, and 23 fantasy points. So, while JSN didn't look great in week 1 and we see some volatility out of JSN and Tyler Lockett, that target share makes me feel pretty good about JSN that he's going to continue to be involved. And this is a strong schedule for the next couple of weeks. The Dolphins, the Lions, the Giants, and the Niners. So we see some pretty good matchups here for Metcalf and JSN. And then there's Tyler Lockett, who had 13 fantasy points in week 1 and 3.5 in week 2. I had him as a sit last week. I'm just not ready to trust Tyler Lockett anytime soon. So for me, he's still a sit. He's going to have these, weeks where he's productive or whatever, but I'm out on Tyler Lockett for the time being. Moving along, we've got the much anticipated matchup between the Carolina Panthers and the Las Vegas Raiders. The Panthers making a switch at the quarterback position. We're going to see the red rifle out there. Andy Dalton's going to be the quarterback. Not Bryce Young. So what does that mean for this wide receiver room that has done nothing to start the fantasy season? I mean, it could certainly be good. I guess. I mean, it can't be much worse than Bryce Young. But I can't trust any of these wide receivers in our starting lineups moving into week 3. Deontay Johnson, what were we doing thinking Deontay Johnson and Dave Canales could turn around this Panthers offense and Deontay could be a viable wide receiver 1 that you draft late? I don't know. If you listen to me on that, then go ahead and roast me in the comments. He is 8.4 fantasy points on the season thus far. It might certainly improve with Andy Dalton at quarterback, but Deontay Johnson, Adam Thielen, Jonathan Mingo, Xavier Leggett, his name's not on the screen because he didn't have a single target in week 2. After 7 targets in week 1, there's just nothing here in this Panthers offense. Let's just move along. We don't want to waste too much time on that. Okay. Devontae Adams is still a star, double digits in each game so far in the season. 10.9 week 1, 26 in week 2 against Baltimore. 12 targets, 9 receptions, 110 receiving yards, a touchdown. He should absolutely feast against this Panthers defense at home. I expect a big day for Devontae Adams, so I think he's a very strong start approaching the week, and you're probably going to start him anyway. Matter of fact, I like Devontae Adams so much this week that I would head straight to Underdog and go ahead and take the over on his receiving yards. And don't forget, you can claim that free new customer pick'em. Aaron Rodgers over half of a total yard to combine with that Devontae Adams over 64.5 receiving yards mark against this god-awful Panthers secondary. And don't worry, if you watch this video later in the week, there will still be a free pick'em for you after Thursday as well. And just don't forget, you're also going to get that 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog when you use promo code the catch. So pair that Devontae Adams line with your free pick'em and go ahead and earn some cash moving into week 3. Jacoby Myers, just the ceiling just hasn't been there. Always seems like a guy who can be kind of like a viable flex option, but so far on the season, Gardner Minshew at quarterback, it just hasn't been a thing. So we're going to sit Jacoby Myers. Trey Tucker also was said. If you're looking at any other Raiders wide receivers, even in this matchup against a awful Panthers defense at home, we just can't trust any of these Raiders wide receivers moving into week 3. Moving along, we've got the 49ers facing off against the Rams, and Deebo Samuel is just going to be a week in, week out start. He has looked so far on the season like the wide receiver you want to own in terms of the 49ers pass catchers. And I think even if he didn't necessarily look that way, you're still probably starting Deebo because the upside's too high. But 18 or more fantasy points in each game so far on this season. You just got to keep Deebo in your starting lineup. This Rams secondary, do they look bad in week 2? And they certainly didn't necessarily look great in week 1 either. So Deebo, a must start. Brandon Ayuk, on the other hand, has been a little rocky to start the season, but he's had 5 targets in each game so far on the year. I still think better days are ahead for Brandon Ayuk. I know he's looked a little rusty. All eyes are on him because he held out for the contract and all that stuff, but I'm not panicked on Ayuk just yet. He's going to face the Rams, the Patriots, the Cardinals, the Hawks, the Chiefs. It's a good blend of kind of weaker secondaries, strong secondaries, game script opportunities. So I think we'll know in the next couple of weeks what we're going to get out of Ayuk this year. But for now, especially against a Rams secondary, it's just been bad. I actually really like Brandon Ayuk this week, so keep him in your starting lineups. I think he'll be okay. Jawan Jennings, there's just not enough here. I mean, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 5 fantasy points in week 2. Just not enough, even in deeper formats, to consider Jawan Jennings. All right, moving along to the Rams. The time I'm recording this, like, I am aware that Cooper Kupp is, probably like 99% chance he's not playing week 3, but left him on the screen. If he starts, then yeah, you can still roll him out there. It's pretty risky because I don't think he's even going to play. So if he does somehow play, I don't really particularly like that for our fantasy lineups, but left him on the screen also because, his health really impacts how we're going to look at the rest of the wide receivers for the Rams moving into the week. I forgot to put Tutu Atwell on the screen. Shout out to Tutu. He deserves some love at the moment, I guess. But we've got a Rams wide receiver room that is just all over the place. And, we had some popular potential waiver wire ads moving into the week with guys like Demarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson, and then even a deep sleeper like Jordan Whittingham. And then, like I said, Tutu as well. But none of these guys had more than 4 targets in week 2. It's just been an absolute mess at the end of the day without a healthy Cooper Kupp or a healthy Puka Nacua. And I'm at this point, very concerned for the Rams offense as a whole and for Matthew Stafford at the quarterback position. So for me, there's some intriguing names here, some names that could get like garbage time points and get points against, weaker secondaries. I still like Demarcus Robinson, for example, but until we see something fluent and concrete out of this offense, I'm hitting that panic button on all of these Rams wide receivers, and I do not want them anywhere near my starting lineup moving into week 3. Moving along, let's take a look at the Lions traveling to face the Cardinals. And these are 2 interesting teams to kind of break down here. You still have to start Amon-Ra St. Brown no matter what. And obviously in week 2, he played a bit better, so that was definitely encouraging to see. I don't think he necessarily played bad in week 1, but certainly the stat line in week 1 had a lot of fantasy managers concerned, where in week 2 he walked away with 22.9 total fantasy points. Everything was there for Amon-Ra. I mean, 19 targets. If we can get 19 targets from to Amon-Ra St. Brown, good things are going to happen. He had 11 receptions, 119 receiving yards. I will note that he's, dealing with a lower leg injury, but I don't think it's going to be anything serious. Amon-Ra should be fine. Not a lot to discuss here, but I had to discuss a little bit because he only had 4 fantasy points in week 1. Amon-Ra, good to go. He's in your starting lineup no matter what when he's healthy. Jameson Williams, another double-digit stat line in week 2. Going into week 1, Jameson Williams was a player I highly encourage you guys to start. Made the video for wide receivers that will dominate week 1. Then I put him back in the video for wide receivers that will dominate week 2. Wasn't as high of a ceiling, but he still had 11 targets, 5 receptions, 79 receiving yards, and 14.4 total fantasy points. So at the time I'm recording this, he's sitting as the wide receiver 7 in fantasy. He is no longer like a flex, boom or bust option, similar to Rashid Shaheed. This is just a player. The way the wide receiver position is looking at this point in the season, who we have to have in our starting lineup. So Jameson Williams gets upgraded to a start moving into week 3. Khalif Raymond, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 5 fantasy points. No reason to consider Khalif Raymond even in deeper formats. Moving along to the Arizona Cardinals. So Marvin Harrison Jr. made the video as well for wide receivers you must start going in to week too. And I actually started to get a little bit more nervous about him as the week went on. We had so many reports coming out about like Marvin Harrison Jr. and sluggish, and Kyler made comments about, I just do like what offensive coordinator tells me to do or whatever it was. And it got to me a little bit, but at the end of the day, I still thought he was a strong start against that Rams secondary. And whew, I mean, honestly, he was on pace for like 60 fantasy points, and it cooled off a little bit, but 8 targets, 4 receptions, 130 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 32 and a half yards per catch, 29 fantasy points. If you were worried about Marvin Harrison after week 1, there is officially no reason to be worried about Marvin Harrison Jr., especially against a secondary like the Lions secondary. And he gets the Commanders secondary in week 4. So no time soon are we benching Marvin Harrison Jr. if you were for some reason even thinking about it. But trust me, after week 1, I got a lot of questions. Plenty of people were. All right, Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, the massive Marvin Harrison Jr. performance affected these two who were better in week 1. They're not even in that flex category. They're on like that watch category. If we start to see something emerge where they're consistent on a regular basis in this offense, they might be low-end flexes, but Wilson, 5.1 fantasy points in week 2. Greg Dortch, 3.1. We're not starting them anytime soon. So you're starting your studs. You're sitting everyone else in this Lions and Cardinals matchup. All right, moving along. Let's take a look at the Ravens traveling to face the Cowboys. Zay Flowers was a start for me last week. He should have been a start for you as well. No reason to really be concerned. When we look at week 1, he should have had 6 or 7 more points added to that stat line because Lamar Jackson missed him wide open in the end zone at the end of the game. Then in week 2, he did score a touchdown. He's had 10 plus targets in each game this year, 22 fantasy points in week 2. This offense is like really reliant on Zay Flowers. He's the only true pass catcher, it feels like. I mean, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely did essentially nothing in week 2, and then there's really no other wide receiver to look at or fear on this team. Bateman, 4 targets, just 7 fantasy points in week 2. Then Nelson Aguilar, 3 targets, 2.3 fantasy points in week 2. So it's Flowers as the primary clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this Ravens team, and we already knew that. The ceiling might not always be super high, but the consistency and the volume is there, so we have to keep Zay Flowers in our starting lineups, and we're not considering any other Ravens. Pass catcher, CeeDee Lamb, who didn't have a fantastic week 1, but still gave you 13.6 fantasy points, had a better week 2 against the Saints, scored that touchdown, 7 targets, 90 receiving yards, 4 receptions, 19 fantasy points. So he still has handed you double digits on a week in, week out basis, and you are still starting CeeDee Lamb no matter what on a week in, week out basis. And don't be too afraid of this Ravens defense on the road. They haven't necessarily been stout so far through the first 2 weeks of the season, especially against wide receivers. Brandon Cooks, I mean, you can always flex Brandon Cooks, but it comes with caution and concern and volatility, and we've seen that through the first 2 games of the season. Had a touchdown week 1 and 14.5 fantasy points, then had 2 targets and 3.6 fantasy points in week 2. So if you want to roll out Brandon Cooks, I'm not going to stop you, but I'm also not going to necessarily go out of my way to start Cooks. But the ceiling is there. His floor is certainly also there. Jalen Tolbert, 9 targets in week 2, 14.2 fantasy points, 82 receiving yards, 6 receptions. So Tolbert, I think, is a low-end, deep stream flex. Like, maybe he deserves just to be in the sit category, but I liked what we saw out of Tolbert in week 2. I think this is a good competitive game script against the Ravens in week 3. I think we could certainly see even more involvement out of Tolbert. So looked good. Probably going to be volatile as well as a flex option, but I think Tolbert, maybe just a player to watch, but if you're in a bad enough situation, I'm okay potentially flexing Jalen Tolbert. We should get a more clear understanding of what happens here in week 3 against the Ravens. All right, moving along, we got the Chiefs traveling to face the Falcons in their first road game of the year, and Rashee Rice, a player I raved about in the offseason, begged you guys to draft wherever you could get him. You just watched him move up on draft boards as the offseason progressed. Had another really solid performance in week 2, 17 fantasy points in week 1, 18.5 in week 2, scored the touchdown against the Bengals. Rashee Rice is a must start on a week in, week out basis. He is dominating the target volume for this entire Chiefs offense, including Travis Kelce through the first 2 games of the season. So I am very high on Rashee Rice. He must stay in your starting lineup. Now, Xavier Worthy, I went into week 2 with much more caution, and like I still considered Worthy a start in week 2, but I also told you guys we got to really look at this volume here and take away the touchdowns and understand that if Worthy doesn't score a touchdown in week 2, you're probably going to be really upset. But this is why we drafted Xavier Worthy, is for that high ceiling and that volatility. So if you own Worthy, you can certainly still flex him. You just have to understand the risk. He's not going to get that big touchdown every week. He's not going to rush for a touchdown every week, all that stuff. But the upside is 100% there. It's just how often we're going to reach that upside. We'll have to see. So I'm still okay flexing Xavier Worthy, but you have to do so with caution. All right. Monday Night Football has not been played at the time I'm recording this, so maybe my opinions on the Falcons wide receivers will change as the week goes on, but I think Drake London will bounce back against the Eagles in week 2, or at least certainly has the opportunity to do so, and I think you can probably still start him in week 3. If he has another absolute dud performance, then maybe he gets kind of downgraded here, but he should be the clear-cut number 1 wide receiver for the Falcons, so I think he can bounce back in week 2 against the Eagles. Go ahead and roast me in the comments if I was completely wrong about this. But other than that, we got Ray McLeod and Darnell Mooney. McLeod had the best target share in week 1. We'll see how things look in week 2. Hard to evaluate these guys without the game being played yet. So I'll leave London in the start category. If my thoughts ultimately change, it'll be in the comment section down below. Next up, we have the Jaguars traveling to face the Bills. And man, oh man, I am worried about this Jaguars offense. Trevor Lawrence looks uninspired, has thrown 1 touchdown through the first 2 games of the season. I'm worried about this passing attack. I've always defended Trevor Lawrence and Christian Kirk. These have been my boys. I don't know right now. I'm very, very, very nervous. So, I mean, when Gabe Davis has been the second most consistent wide receiver on this team, I think we definitely have to have the panic meter on Christian Kirk all the way ramped up. So Kirk gets downgraded to a sit after 0.9 fantasy points in week 2 and 4 in week 1. Where you drafted him, he should be playing as a low-end wide receiver 2 at worst, and he has been quite the opposite. So Kirk is a sit for me. Gabe Davis is also a sit. You know, week 1 was okay at 9.2 fantasy points. Week 2, 7.3. There's just not enough. Are you ever going to trust Gabe Davis in your starting lineup? No. But Brian Thomas Jr. has been the bright spot here. If you're a Brian Thomas Jr. truther in the offseason, you may have found yourself a good bargain. Still only 4 targets in each game this year, but 14 fantasy points in week 1 with that touchdown, 11.4 in week 2. Overall has looked good, has looked like he's going to be able to make big plays. If you saw that big catch in week 2, that really solidified his total stat line because he still only had 2 receptions. And then in week 1, we saw the touchdown grab as well. So Brian Thomas Jr., although I'm worried about the Jaguars offense, remains a solid flex option until further notice. And I do think this game script against the Bills will benefit him in this matchup. Moving along to the Bills wide receivers, who are also, you know, a big head scratch on what we're going to do on a week in, week out basis. I think that we have to consider Khalil Shakir as a start moving forward. I think he has kind of showed that he's going to be like the most consistent wide receiver on this team. 3 targets in week 1, but a touchdown. 5 targets in week 2, but 54 receiving yards and 5 receptions, 10.8 yards per catch. 10.6 fantasy points. So he's walked away with double digits in the first 2 games on this season so far. And once again, maybe the ceiling's not super high, but in full PPR and the flex where you drafted Shakir, you probably feel okay. So maybe it's not fair to call Brian Thomas Jr. a flex and Khalil Shakir a start, but I would say just overall, I feel more confident about the Bills' offense in comparison to the Jaguars' offense. Plus, the Bills are at home this week. So, you know, don't go crazy on me in the comments. And we look at the rest of these Bills wide receivers. Keon Coleman gave us a goose egg in week 2 after a pretty promising 9.1 performance in week 1. So I just am going to stay away from Keon Coleman. You don't need to drop him, but let's stay away for now. Curtis Samuel had 2 targets, and Matt Collins had 1 target after having 2 in week 1 and a touchdown in week 1. So I'm staying away from the rest of this Bills wide receiver room. It's not a bad matchup here. Should be a good game script, but man, I just can't trust any of these guys outside of Khalil Shakir, and even then, the ceiling is relatively low. Right, last but not least, let's take a look at the Commanders traveling to face the Bengals. And Terry McLaurin had a good matchup in week 2, but didn't do a whole lot with it. It was better than week 1. He did have 8 targets and 6 receptions, 22 receiving yards, 8.2 fantasy points. So he gets moved from a start. I left him in the start category going into week 2 because they were playing the Giants, and he gets downgraded to a flex. But I think the bigger concern here is the quarterback position. Not that Jaden Daniels is playing awful, and he's certainly been okay in fantasy through the first 2 games, but he's been okay because he can run the football. Jaden Daniels also did not throw or run for a touchdown, but more importantly for this video, throw a touchdown in week 2, and he also did not in week 1. So Terry McLaurin might be the true number 1 wide receiver on this team, but his ceiling is being limited by the quarterback play here. So it's not particularly a bad matchup here, but I think the bigger issue for Terry McLaurin is you look at the rest of this Washington Commanders wide receiver room. There's some guys here, but they're just guys, you know? So when defenses are making their game plan, it's like, yeah, we got to shut down Terry McLaurin, and it's very easy to do so because Noah Brown, Luke McCaffrey, Dewami Brown, like there's just nothing here, and you don't need to consider starting any of those guys anytime soon in fantasy. So I do worry about Terry McLaurin, single digits in both games this year. He gets downgraded for me to a flex on the road against the Bengals here in week 3. Moving along, we got the Bengals wide receivers. Yeah, I'm still starting Jamar Chase, and I'm not going to go into week 3 with a ton of concern because they're playing the Washington Commanders, and this secondary is bad. And by bad, I mean the worst in the league. So this should be a good bounce back opportunity for an 0-2 Bengals team and a good overall bounce back opportunity for this Bengals offense, including their wide receiver. So Chase, I would actually say Chase is a must start this week. I think this will be easily his best game of the season. Then the Bengals have another good opportunity in week 4 against the Panthers. So, you know, if you're worried about this Bengals offense, they got 2 get right games in the next 2 weeks. T. Higgins plays. Yes, I will consider T. Higgins a start because, once again, they're playing the Washington Commanders. So I think there's a chance that T. Higgins maybe sits out the next 2 games because I don't know that the Bengals are necessarily going to need him out there, but I could also see, you know, these are good get-right games. Maybe don't need to play, you know, a full snap count and all that stuff, so we might see Higgins back. So that does bring us to Andre Uzavis, who, you know, I think if Higgins doesn't play, you could certainly consider flexing after scoring 2 touchdowns in week 2, but it's still been a low volume kind of situation for Yoshi. 2 receptions, 2 touchdowns, like sounds good, but it's really not good when you break it down because you take away those touchdowns or even one of those touchdowns. This is not a good fantasy performance in week 2 for Yoshi. So it depends on T. Higgins' health. If he does not play, I do think you can flex Yoshi because it's the Commanders. And you could probably flex him again next week because it's the Panthers. But if it wasn't for those 2 things, I'd still be pretty wary about putting Andre Uzavis in my starting lineup. Trenton Irwin had 6 targets in week 2 and did next to nothing with him with 1.5 fantasy points. So he can stay as a sit. Then we did see a big grab out of rookie Jermaine Burton, but he's had just 2 targets through the first 2 games of the season. We're not starting him anytime soon either. So trust Chase if you own him. I think he's going to have a great bounce back week against the Washington Commanders. And let's hope that Washington Commanders offense can start throwing some touchdowns and help out our boy, Scary Terry. That'll do it for today's video. There is every matchup, every relevant wide receiver, and all of our starts and sits moving into week 3 of 2024 fantasy football. Do not forget, as the week progresses, we will have everything that you guys need for week 3, starts and sits at every single position, wide receivers and running backs that will dominate week 3, by low targets for week 3, last minute waiver wire additions for week 3, as well as a full breakdown Sunday morning of all the week 3 fantasy football updates that you need to No, and don't forget, we will have our must-start defenses, our must-start kickers, and we already have our early waiver wire video out for the week as well. So as the week goes on, I will have all of those links pinned down below, and make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any of that content as the week goes on. But most importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions, drop them down below. I will answer every single fantasy football question in the comments section down below. With that, I will say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on the catch.